The aerial theater of the Second World War over the skies of Western Europe remains one of the most violently contested and technologically dynamic domains in the history of human conflict, a relentless vertical battlefield where the fate of nations was dictated by the rapid evolution of aviation engineering and the brutal mathematics of attrition. In the early years of the conflict, the German Luftwaffe reigned supreme, having forged an aura of invincibility during the Blitzkrieg campaigns across Poland, the Low Countries, and France, relying on the tactical brilliance of their veteran pilots and the advanced engineering of their primary fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and later the formidable Focke-Wulf FW 190. When the United States Army Air Forces began to arrive in England in 1942 to establish the 8th Air Force and launch the daylight strategic bombing campaign against the industrial heartland of the Third Reich, the German Jagdwaffe, or fighter force, viewed the American aviators with a mixture of professional curiosity and profound underestimation. The Germans had honed their skills in the skies over Britain and the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, developing a cadre of elite fighter aces, known as Experten, who had amassed staggering personal kill scores that defied the imagination of Allied planners. It was within this climate of supreme confidence that the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was introduced to the European theater, a massive, unorthodox, and seemingly clumsy fighter that initially provoked widespread mockery among the German pilots. Yet, beneath the jokes and the initial disdain lay an engineering masterpiece that would soon prompt dire warnings from the most astute German fighter aces, warnings that were ultimately ignored by the Nazi high command as the Luftwaffe was inexorably drawn into a catastrophic meat grinder that would claim the lives of over 13,000 of their pilots and shatter the aerial defense of the Reich. To understand the profound shock and eventual devastation that the P-47 Thunderbolt inflicted upon the Luftwaffe, one must first examine the radical design philosophy that birthed the aircraft. Designed by the brilliant Georgian émigré Alexander Kartveli, the P-47 was a direct response to the United States military's demand for a high-altitude interceptor capable of escorting heavy bombers and engaging enemy fighters in the thin air of the stratosphere. Unlike the sleek, lightweight fighters favored by European air forces, Kartveli designed the Thunderbolt around a single, massive power plant, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row, 18-cylinder radial engine that produced an astonishing 2,000 horsepower. To allow this colossal engine to breathe at high altitudes, Kartveli integrated a complex, massive turbo supercharger system deep within the fuselage of the aircraft, routing exhaust gases from the engine back to the tail to spin the turbine, which then forced compressed air forward back into the engine. This intricate plumbing system necessitated a massive fuselage, resulting in an aircraft that weighed over 14,000 pounds fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a standard German Bf 109 or the British Supermarine Spitfire. When the first P-47s arrived in England in early 1943, their sheer size stunned both Allied and Axis observers. British pilots joked that a P-47 pilot could evade enemy fire simply by unbuckling his harness and running around inside the spacious cockpit. German intelligence, evaluating the early reconnaissance photographs and combat reports, initially dismissed the jug, as it was affectionately called by its pilots due to its resemblance to a milk jug, as a bloated, unmaneuverable target that would be easy prey for the nimble German interceptors. The first combat encounters between the P-47 and the Luftwaffe seemed to confirm German prejudices. In the tight, turning dogfights that characterized early aerial warfare, the heavy Thunderbolt struggled to match the turn rate and acceleration of the FW 190 and the Bf 109. German pilots, utilizing their superior maneuverability, would outturn the Americans, scoring hits on the massive fuselages and returning to base to report that the new American fighter was a clumsy behemoth. Hermann Göring, the supreme commander of the Luftwaffe, famously boasted that the American fighters were inferior to German designs and that his Jagdwaffe would effortlessly sweep them from the skies, protecting the fatherland from the daylight bombing raids. However, this early arrogance masked a fundamental misunderstanding of the P-47's true capabilities, a misunderstanding that the most experienced and observant German aces quickly began to realize as the air war intensified. Men like Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, and Egon Mayer, a highly decorated ace who commanded JG-2, Richthofen, began to study the flight characteristics of the Thunderbolt not with disdain, but with a growing sense of alarm. They realized that while the P-47 could not outturn a German fighter, it possessed a set of attributes that, if utilized correctly by American pilots, made it arguably the most lethal fighter in the sky. The warning issued by these observant German aces centered on three distinct, terrifying characteristics of the Thunderbolt: its unprecedented diving speed, its devastating firepower, and its near-mythical ruggedness. Because of its immense weight and aerodynamically clean design, the P-47 could dive faster than any propeller-driven aircraft in the world. When a German pilot attempted to break off an engagement by entering a steep dive, a standard evasive maneuver that had worked flawlessly against the lighter Spitfires and early model P-38 Lightnings, they were horrified to find the massive Thunderbolt accelerating right behind them, closing the distance with terrifying speed. American pilots, learning to exploit the vertical plane rather than the horizontal, adopted boom and zoom tactics. They would fly at high altitudes, utilizing the turbo supercharger to maintain peak engine performance, spot the German formations below, and plunge into devastating, high-speed dives. They would strike the German fighters before they could react, and then use the tremendous kinetic energy generated by the dive to zoom back up to a safe altitude, completely dictating the terms of the engagement. The German aces warned their squadrons that diving away from a Thunderbolt was suicide, a complete inversion of the established tactical doctrine that threw the Luftwaffe defensive strategies into chaos. Furthermore, the firepower of the P-47 was a terrifying shock to the German pilots. Kartveli had mounted 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in the wings of the Thunderbolt, 4 on each side, providing an overwhelming volume of fire. When a P-47 pilot squeezed the trigger, the aircraft unleashed a literal wall of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition that could saw the wing off a German fighter, detonate its fuel tanks, or completely obliterate its cockpit in a fraction of a second. The kinetic energy delivered by the 8 heavy machine guns was so massive that it could physically stall the P-47 in midair if fired continuously, but in combat, only a short, concentrated burst was required to destroy an enemy aircraft. German pilots, accustomed to fighting aircraft with lighter armament, were stunned by the sheer destructive capability of the Jug. An American pilot did not need to keep his sights on a highly maneuverable FW-190 for long. A fleeting, 1-second deflection shot was often enough to shatter the German plane. The German aces warned that passing in front of the guns of a Thunderbolt, even for an instant, was a fatal error, forcing the Luftwaffe to adopt far more cautious and conservative tactics when engaging the American escorts. Perhaps the most demoralizing aspect of the P-47 for the Luftwaffe was its incredible survivability. The massive R2800 radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines of the P-51 Mustang or the Bf-109, had no vulnerable cooling system, meaning it could absorb massive amounts of battle damage and continue to run. The engine itself acted as an armored shield for the pilot, absorbing cannon shells that would have otherwise struck the cockpit. The sheer bulk of the fuselage allowed Republic engineers to build an incredibly strong airframe, with heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a robust structural design that could withstand punishing G-forces and enemy fire. German pilots returned from sorties in absolute disbelief, reporting that they had poured hundreds of rounds of 20mm cannon fire into a P-47, shredding its wings, blowing away half its tail, and setting it on fire, only to watch the American aircraft refuse to go down, limping back across the English Channel to safety. This ruggedness had a profound psychological impact on the German defenders. They realized they were fighting an enemy that could not only outdive them and outgun them but could also survive hits that would instantly disintegrate a German fighter. The warning from the German aces was clear: the American aircraft was a flying tank, and attempting to shoot it down required a sustained, dangerous commitment that exposed the German pilots to lethal counterattacks. Despite these dire warnings from the frontline commanders, the high command of the Luftwaffe, insulated in Berlin and obsessed with political posturing, failed to grasp the strategic shift that was occurring in the skies over Europe. They continued to demand that the Jagdwaffe intercept the heavily armed American bomber formations, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, ignoring the fact that the bombers were now being escorted deep into Germany by the very fighters the aces had warned them about. The introduction of external drop tanks in late 1943 extended the range of the P-47, allowing it to escort the bombers all the way to targets in western and central Germany. When the American commanders, notably General Jimmy Doolittle, changed the tactical doctrine of the 8th Air Force fighters in early 1944, the fate of the Luftwaffe was sealed. Doolittle ordered his fighter pilots to stop flying close escort, tethered to the slow bombers, and instead granted them permission to range far ahead of the bomber streams, actively hunting down the German interceptors before they could even form up for an attack. The P-47s, unleashed from their defensive roles, became predatory hunters, sweeping the skies and engaging the Luftwaffe on American terms. This shift in tactics initiated a period of aerial carnage that would break the back of the German fighter force. During the spring of 1944, in a series of massive aerial battles known as Big Week, and the subsequent months leading up to the invasion of Normandy, the P-47 Thunderbolts, later joined by the longer-ranged P-51 Mustangs, engaged in a systematic campaign of annihilation against the Jagdwaffe. The German pilots, desperately trying to climb to altitude to intercept the bombers, were frequently bounced by high-flying formations of Thunderbolts plunging out of the sun. The resulting battles were a slaughter. The experienced German Experten, the veterans who had survived years of combat, were slowly but surely killed or wounded, overwhelmed by the sheer numerical superiority and the aggressive tactics of the American pilots. The loss of these irreplaceable veterans was the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. They possessed the institutional knowledge, the tactical brilliance, and the combat instincts necessary to survive against the American onslaught, and as they were shot down, the overall quality of the German fighter force began to plummet rapidly. The attrition suffered by the Luftwaffe during this period was staggering, resulting in the loss of an estimated 13,000 fighter pilots in the defense of the Reich campaign alone. This catastrophic loss of human life was not merely a military defeat, it was the collapse of a highly specialized, elite warrior caste that the Third Reich could never replace. As the veterans fell, the German High Command was forced to replace them with increasingly younger, inexperienced recruits. Because the relentless Allied bombing of German synthetic oil plants had severely curtailed the availability of aviation fuel, these new pilots were given only a fraction of the flight training hours required to master their high-performance aircraft. They were rushed into combat with barely enough training to take off and land safely, entirely unequipped to face the highly trained, aggressive, and well-equipped American fighter pilots. When these novice German pilots were sent up to intercept the bomber streams, they were mercilessly slaughtered by the prowling Thunderbolts and Mustangs. They did not know how to evade the diving attacks, they did not understand the principles of energy fighting, and they panicked when subjected to the overwhelming firepower of the American 8-gun batteries. The air war over Germany ceased to be a duel between equals and became an industrial execution, a tragic, bloody meat grinder that consumed the youth of Germany in a futile attempt to defend a collapsing empire. The German aces who survived to witness this slaughter watched in despair as the warnings they had issued months earlier materialized in the form of burning FW-190s and Bf-109s spiraling out of the sky. They saw their squadrons decimated, refilled with terrified boys, and decimated again in a matter of days. The American industrial machine, having produced over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts during the course of the war, ensured that the American squadrons were always at full strength, constantly replacing the few aircraft they lost with brand-new, technologically upgraded models. The Germans, conversely, found their aircraft production dispersed, bombed, and disrupted, struggling to provide their novice pilots with functioning aircraft. Even when German industry managed to produce new fighters, the lack of trained pilots to fly them rendered the aircraft useless. The P-47, the aircraft that Hermann Göring had mocked as a clumsy joke, had become the primary instrument of the Luftwaffe's destruction, a relentless, roaring testament to American industrial might and aeronautical engineering. As the Allies secured air superiority over Europe and the invasion of Normandy commenced in June 1944, the role of the P-47 Thunderbolt shifted dramatically, further compounding the misery of the German military. With the Luftwaffe largely swept from the skies, the immense power, ruggedness, and payload capacity of the Thunderbolt were turned against the German ground forces. The P-47 transitioned from a high-altitude escort fighter to a low-level fighter-bomber, affectionately known as the Jabbo, by the terrified German soldiers who faced it. Equipped with 500-pound bombs, high-velocity aerial rockets, Havar, and napalm, the Thunderbolt became the most feared tactical strike aircraft of the war. Roaming the skies over France, Belgium, and eventually Germany, the P-47 pilots of the 9th Air Force and other tactical commands engaged in a relentless campaign of interdiction, destroying trains, convoys, armor columns, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The same ruggedness that allowed the P-47 to survive aerial combat made it the perfect platform for ground attack, allowing it to fly through intense storms of German anti-aircraft fire, deliver its ordnance with pinpoint accuracy, and survive hits that would have destroyed any other aircraft. The psychological impact of the P-47 Jabot on the German ground forces was devastating. German commanders reported that daytime movement had become utterly impossible. Any vehicle that ventured onto the roads, any train that attempted to move supplies, and any armored column that broke cover was immediately pounced upon by swarms of Thunderbolts. The distinctive, deep roar of the R2800 engine became the sound of impending death for the Wehrmacht. The 8.50 caliber machine guns, originally designed to tear apart enemy aircraft, proved equally devastating against soft-skinned vehicles, locomotives, and infantry, while the rockets and bombs shattered German armor and fortifications. The P-47s created a zone of absolute paralysis behind the German lines, preventing them from moving reinforcements, supplying their frontline troops, or executing organized retreats. The warnings of the German fighter aces regarding the lethal potential of the P-47 had not only proven true in the air but had now descended to the earth, visiting destruction upon the entire German military apparatus. The total collapse of the German war machine in the West was facilitated in large part by the undisputed control of the tactical airspace exercised by the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft that defied aesthetic conventions to deliver raw, unadulterated combat power, leaving behind a legacy of absolute devastation that the 13,000 lost pilots of the Luftwaffe paid for with their lives, victims of an enemy they were told to mock, a machine they were built to underestimate, and an industrial reality they could never hope to overcome.